So one of the questions we get most in the Career Options Resource Center is, I'm concentrating in creative writing, I'm about to graduate, now what do I do? And so I'm so happy to have PJ here because I don't know what you're supposed to do, but PJ does. PJ was a creative writing concentrator at Hampshire and wrote both fiction and nonfiction as part of his Div 3. It was a book of short stories, and also studied music. So if you are I guess there's no real typical Hampshire person, but PJ's studies at Hampshire were very Hampshire in that they weren't so focused on one particular thing or another. So if you find yourself in that situation, there is hope for you. So PJ went on to do a number of different things. First, writing long form journalism in magazines and newspapers, taught journalism at a high school, and finally found himself as a producer at NBC News based in Los Angeles. So he does streaming video and also sometimes works on stories for NBC Nightly News and the Today Show. So if you are somebody who's interested in nonfiction content, PJ's kind of done the whole gamut of it. So I hope some of your questions will be answered today. And at the end, we'll also give PJ's contact information so you can follow up and have an individual conversation if you would like. And with that, I will turn it over to PJ.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you for that lovely introduction. That's very nice and flattering, and all true, mostly. So yeah, my name is PJ Tobia. I do work at NBC News. And when I first left Hampshire, you know, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to write, and I also knew I wanted to tell stories. And so I've been very, very lucky to be able to continue doing both of those things throughout my career. I wanted to start by explaining what it is that I do. I tell people I'm a television news producer, and that's true. A lot of people don't really know what that is. So I thought I'd start with a few examples of my work and the kind of work that people with my job description and skills do. And the basic skills of television news producing are the same for a lot of kinds of journalism, and that's news gathering, information gathering, getting sources, learning about trends and news events, trying to get a little bit ahead of events and figure out what might be happening so you can put yourself in a position to be someplace when a news event is going to happen, or when a kind of trend is developing in society or politics or sort of world politics, whatever. And then with television, there's the added thing of the skill set of knowing how to use a camera. In my case, I shoot and edit a lot of my own stuff. So this first few clips I'm going to play are a series of pieces that were based on my reporting, information that I gathered ahead of time to put myself in a place where I knew a news event might happen. And then I gathered the footage myself with a camera and edited it together to create a narrative story.
This is the Kill House. Move. Part of a training ground for a right-wing militia in the American South.
This is for conducting military operations in urban terrain. We want to practice and rehearse moving up to these structures, covering each other, taking cover and concealment everywhere we can find it.
2 shots, 2 kills. These men and women call themselves the Georgia Security Force.
DA. Clear my rifle.
Our common goal is to provide for security for ourselves, our friends, and our families, and the other people in our states.
The violent clashes began before a so-called Unite the Right rally scheduled to take place in Charlottesville's McIntyre Park.
You were near the area when the car plowed into the protesters. Describe that scene. We've kind of seen pictures here and there throughout the day, but what was it like in there?
Well, actually, at that moment, Hari, the protest had turned kind of festive. There were people with funny signs, there was laughing and singing and chanting. And then all of a sudden, you heard the screech of tires and a rush of people coming the other direction. And the tone changed dramatically. People were calling for medics. There were bloody people on the street. There was someone performing CPR, a lot of people heaving and crying. And within minutes, EMTs were on the way.
Heimbach took zero responsibility for an event that led to death and injury.
Someone died yesterday because of your rally. I mean, a rally you helped organize. Someone's dead from that. You know? How do you feel about that? Do you feel at all responsible?
Not at all.
So there you go. There's that's kind of a basic outline of kind of what what the basic skills of journalism are, of television journalism are. The militia thing was a trend that I had seen building for a few years. That was back in both of those pieces, that was back in 2016, the militia piece. And so I had seen that coming for a few years and kind of started work on that. And that piece and others like it, I did something on white nationalists that like kind of launched me into that world of right-wing extremism. And I saw it as a trend that was building. And so there were a bunch of groups that I had been in touch with that I knew were going to be in Charlottesville that August. And so I thought, well, this is a place where I should be. And my bosses at the time weren't that psyched about it. I was supposed to be covering the Middle East, and I was covering the development of the Iran deal. I was based in Washington for PBS NewsHour at that time. And so they were like, well, it's a weekend, so you can go, kind of thing. But I went, and we were all glad that I did, because we had a camera on the ground for what turned out to be this major news event. And so that's sort of like the basics of like the nuts and bolts of television news gathering and reporting. The sort of next level of that is working with a large crew, right? That's when you're not shooting. When you're a producer like me, you're working with a couple of camera operators, or one camera operator and a sound operator, and a correspondent, someone who's on camera. In the Charlottesville stuff, I was on camera. I used to do that. I don't do it anymore. But you're sort of the boss on the ground, managing this team. It's a team of equals, but like if anything goes wrong, the producer gets blamed for it most of the time. And so when you're the kind of next level of this is managing a team on the ground, working with them to create a beautiful story, a narrative, and then getting all the footage, going back to the bureau, writing it up, cutting it and editing it, and getting it on the air. And I have some examples of that from my time at Vice News Tonight on HBO. And let's watch that together now. So you never see me in any of those pieces, but I worked very hard on all of those. The ride along with Border Patrol, though, that was my sourcing that got us into that car with that Border Patrol officer. I shot a bunch of that footage. I was in the front seat shooting I was in the back seat shooting our correspondent, David Noriega, who's a sensational reporter in his own right. And I shot some of the other footage when those migrants were crossing. But for the most part, you don't see me or the camera operator or the sound guy, but it's really a team sport. When you see a television news package, there are a bunch of people that really make that happen. And it's the producer's role to often find the story, nail down the details, like, getting the access to the Border Patrol ride along, figuring out just really basic stuff. When are we going to leave? When are we going to show up in this place? How long do we have to be there? What's the budget for this? How do we get this in under budget? Managing up with the people back at headquarters. And that takes me sort of to the final aspect of this that I just wanted to get through at the top here, which is managing in big organizations. And so when I moved to NBC News about a year and a half ago, a lot of what happens is navigating a big organization with lots of moving parts. I work for the streaming service, but I work with teams from Nightly News and from MSNBC and all over the organization to tell stories. And so being able to leverage those relationships and knowing how to lean on people with many more talents and skills than I, and get them to put those talents and skills to the service of a story that I want to tell, or my correspondent wants to tell, or my boss wants us to tell, or his boss wants us to tell, is a whole other thing. So I'll show you a couple of clips from NBC. These are mostly from the last year and a half. I shot most of these, but not all of it. And some of this was footage that ended up in other places. Some of it just ended up on the website. Some of this ended up on Nightly News with Lester Holt. So I'll roll that right now. Yeah, so you can kind of see the arc there. Like, the PBS stuff it's deep, but the production values are much different than Vice on HBO, which was this, we had big teams and everything was colorized and the audio, every audio event was perfect. And the NBC stuff tends to be like much more immediate. It's a quicker turnaround, still pretty high quality, but like, it's just it's a bit of a faster pace because it's a bigger news organization with so many more outlets. I mean, we're on basically 24 hours a day. Someplace in the world, there's an NBC news program happening, often live. So that's pretty much those are pretty good examples of my work and what television news producers do. Hampshire was really critical for me in learning how to do this because it's project-based learning, and my job is project-based. And I went to grad school in 2004 at the Columbia School of Journalism, and that to me Hampshire was much harder in most ways, in pretty much every way actually, because just academically it was more challenging, and I was already prepared for Columbia. It was pass-fail like Hampshire. It was project-based like Hampshire. You had to work in teams often like Hampshire. You had to develop a really good relationship with professors who took you seriously, like as at Hampshire. And so in many ways, Columbia was a breeze by comparison, especially my last couple of years at Hampshire. The Div 3 was really a challenge, but and also the professors at Hampshire just definitely cared more. I mean, the Columbia professors were great practitioners, but I don't know. I got a great education at Hampshire. I can't say enough nice things about that. But anyway, so that's, I'm not going to lecture you guys about American journalism or anything. I'm wondering if one question that I always ask when I speak to folks, because this is something I genuinely care about, is how you all consume news to the extent that you do. I would love to hear a little bit. You can answer in the chat, and Sharon maybe can let me know. Oh, there you go. I'd love to know how you guys consume news, what your relationship is with news. I know the last 4 to 6 years have been really turbulent in terms of Americans' trust in news. NPR, yeah, love NPR. Axios, that's interesting. Axios did a lot, especially in the early days. They had an HBO show, or maybe it was a Showtime show that was very much like the Vice news program, where it was this kind of serious, very in-depth kind of programming that they gave everything time to breathe, and everything looked really lovely. Sky tends to binge. Yeah, I get that too. PBS is good for it, right? Yes, thanks, Jordan. Yeah, no. So anyway, I did, as Jordan notes in the chat there, I used to at NewsHour I covered foreign affairs primarily. So I covered the Middle East and the Iran deal. I covered what else? The Syria uprising, all from Washington. I did some travel in the region, but the PBS budget and their model was really just a lot of finding experts, finding people who we can all trust, who usually have skin in the game, who have been involved in negotiations, to talk about, to explain the news of the day, and also like kind of bigger picture stuff, 30,000 foot stuff. Daniel, I consume a lot of news from NPR, so, all good places. Oh, you worked in TV, Daniel? Where did you work? Any place that I would have? Oh, and you're muted. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
I'm a freelancer. I've had my own TV production company for many years.
That's so cool. Where are you based?
I'm in New York City.
That's fantastic.
In Chelsea, right at the moment.
That's awesome. What kind of content do you do?
Well, most of the content I've been doing lately has been Broadway theater plays. Of course, not much this year. But I used to do for PBS. I worked on their learning thing, and
yep.
Basically whoever hired me, so sometimes it would be documentary style. It was mostly field work.
You shoot and edit your own stuff?
I shoot it and record audio, but I very rarely edit it for that stuff. I was not the editor.
Sure.
I would hand off the media as much as possible. But when I started having a producer and a cameraman and a sound man was the only way you could actually get anything, because every job was more fragile. And then over time, I know how to edit. I do have skills, but I tried not to be the producer most of the time.
Right.
But, when I'm the DP on a documentary, the cameraman, you know, who has to figure out what to shoot, along with the producer, you know, and then try and put the whole project together. It's a little different.
Totally. Sharon, did you have a question or?
Yeah, well, I wanted to do a time check for all of us. It's 5:30 and we still have half an hour. And I'm wondering, you know, the title of the talk, creating nonfiction, and that you also have a background in print journalism. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you can think back or put yourself in the place of a Hampshire student graduating today with a writing degree. How do you get from there, you know, perhaps into print journalism and then to where you are? What's the trajectory for somebody trying to get into this?
Yeah, I thought about this question because we had discussed this when we first talked about having me on for this talk, and it's a hard one because even so, I completed my Div 3 in 2000, and I really went into journalism a couple of years after that seriously, and even then the landscape was changing so quickly for print. You know, the budgets were much smaller. You know, Craigslist was really starting to take a big bite out of everything. More importantly, and this gets downplayed, but the hedge funds were buying up media companies, newspapers, and kind of bleeding them dry. So like a lot of the on-ramps, their internships just started evaporating, especially at the big places. But here's the thing is if you can get some additional skills to your writing, you don't have to be a great video shooter. If you can just like if you can learn how to shoot a good video sequence with your phone, you know, and just edit it very quickly, that's added value to someone who's a really good writer and reporter. And so if you're interested in telling nonfiction stories, I'm not saying you have to do more than writing, but just taking the extra little step, maybe learning a little bit about audio recording so you can sell yourself as something of a podcast engineer. You know, and additionally, if you're interested in nonfiction, just learning how to report, like learning how, and that was a big one for me because in Hampshire, it was all about storytelling. And I learned so much about how to build and construct a narrative. But reporting, that is gathering facts, finding out who said what and when, finding out how much that thing that the city built or bought cost. That's a really good, hard skill that's also very transferable. So I would say that if you're still at Hampshire, find one of those skills, you know, whether it's a little bit of video, a little bit of audio, or a lot of reporting. If you can marry that to your writing, you will be, I mean, that makes you much more versatile, and not just in narrative storytelling, like wanting to get an internship at a newspaper or a magazine or a website. Also, you know, knowing how to find information is something that people in all aspects of the sort of creative working world, from advertising and marketing to branding and everything else. I mean, even law, just knowing how to use an information database beyond a Google search is like huge. And if you can marry that kind of skill to a very talented storyteller, to someone who knows how to write, you're really you'll be very marketable, I'd say. Jordan, did you have a question? I see your hand is up. Is that what that is? Or are you just waving?
No, it's a hand up, PJ.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, full disclosure, PJ and I were pretty close friends when he was at DC at PBS, and you know, one of the things, PJ, I always kind of noticed is you had a freakishly good sense for what was going to be a big thing in about 6 to 12 months. So the right-wing militia movement, you were one of the first major producers and journalists to embed and to go deep with that. I want to say Q too.
Oh yeah, I almost included my Q clip of me explaining to Judy Woodruff that it was like they thought Democrats were a demon sex cult, but
And I mean, PJ, you were so far ahead of it that in the new documentaries that are coming out about Q, there's often a clip of you talking about it kind of early. And I don't know, maybe being at Hampshire gave you some sensitivity to trends or something like that. But I've always been a little bit curious how you found, you know, stories in those and how to tell them.
Oh, thanks, Jordan. I think a big part of it is, you know, you'll find if you get into the media world that it's very narrow in terms of what people consume. I mean, even in asking you guys, we've got MSNBC, major networks, NPR, the New York Times, you know, stuff like that. It's all stuff, everybody's reading the same stuff. And when you get to a newsroom in Washington, DC or New York City, they're all reading that stuff. So if you can get a little bit far afield, like part of the reason why I got into why I knew the militia and white nationalist movement was building is because I was really into like the right-wing blogosphere. So you could just see from the comment section, like there are like, it was building, like there are some real reactionary right-wing kind of movements. And I had always known about the history of these movements going back to the 70s. But it had always been kind of like a weird fascination, like an interest of mine, from a historical perspective. But because my media diet was so much broader, I was able to see some stuff that was like, oh, that I see this as a trend. And part of the risk of that is that when you bring that up in a news meeting with very serious journalists, they'll be like, okay, you know, this is your weird little hobby horse that you're on. But sometimes that weird little hobby horse turns into like a major story that raids the Capitol building 5 years later and tries to basically undo a democratic, like a democratic election outcome. So that's a thing. But I think that's part of it, Jordan, is just being, you know, the establishment is a real thing, and many people in and of the establishment, of which I am definitely part of the establishment, consume a lot of the same media, talk to the same people, they drink in the same bars. Like it's, you know, it's a lot of the echo chamber thing that people talk about. Good starting point for trying to build reporting skills, ask Sky. That's a really good question. Damn, I wish I had an answer for you. So like a good prompt is just, one thing that's interesting is first to learn what reporting is. So go through a newspaper article or a television news script and see what all the facts are, and then try and figure out where the facts in that story came from. And that'll teach you a little bit about how it's done. And then the next thing is to just set a reporting goal for yourself, like try and figure something out. Like, I would like to know why X happens, or I would like to know why. I mean, you have to be curious about the world. That's like the number one thing. But like, when I was a kid growing up in Philly, like Aramark had this company called Aramark had the concessions at the Philadelphia airport, and the food was terrible. And I was a high school kid, and I remember being like insanely curious about how did Aramark get this concession? I could be messing this up, but that's what I remember. Anyway, and so like I kind of went on this little mission. I went to the library. I did some research. I just like found out a little bit about like airport concession contracting. This is incredibly dull, but I wanted to know. And like that was like a reporting thing. You know, I got like really obsessed with like the omnibus farm bill in the mid 90s, weirdly. And this is in high school before Hampshire. And so like I just went on a deep dive. This is all library-based stuff. This is like pre-internet. So you just learn about something and try and like ask yourself a question and try and figure out the answer. The next step really, and this is what a lot of people just starting out forget, is you got to pick up the phone. The only way to report is to pick up the phone. The internet is not your friend in most cases when it comes to reporting. You have to get people on the phone, hear their voices, and get them to explain why something's going on. Call the county clerk, call the police spokesperson. Like those, that's where reporting happens, is pretty much over the phone. You'll get good leads from the internet sometimes, but you know, ask yourself a question about your community and start, you know, especially your local community, because you know your local newspaper probably isn't there anymore, and if it is, they're not doing what they used to do. So there's a vacuum, and if you just start asking some questions about why things are the way they are in the community, and they can be good things. I don't mean like corruption and badness, but you'll find some interesting lore. Your corner of the city, just your neighborhood, a place like Chelsea or wherever, any neighborhood in the New York City is going to have 100 stories on every corner, pretty much. Anyway, that's a great question, and there's probably better answers out there, but that one's mine. So how do you see this field change in the coming years? The rise of startups like Substack, while others are turning away from mainstream cable news to more partisan YouTube channels and podcasts. The second part of that question really worries me. That people, I mean, we're so far beyond, you know, the big three networks that everyone tunes into, Walter Cronkite, whatever. But it's when platforms, I mean, there are YouTubers that I've never heard of, you've never heard of, that have like, you know, 1 million plus followers, 500,000 followers, and that people, those followers trust much more than any you know, legitimate news broadcast, or mainstream broadcast, I should say. And I'm not sure there's a real answer for it, except that, you know, where misinformation is being spread, I think the platforms are starting to realize they've got to do something. I don't think legislatively there's a real answer. But as far as where the field is going because of that, I think for me, it's again doubling down on the skills. If you know how to report and find something and use some technology like a camera or some audio recording device, or know how to write really well and quickly on deadline, that's what most of those YouTubers don't have. They just get up there and they talk and they throw to sound that someone else gathered, or, you know, they do an interview. So they might be good talkers, but they won't know how to gather information. Gathering information is a skill that very few of those YouTubers have that I've seen. I'm not an expert in the genre. So I think that if you can get a hard skill, you will still be employable, because I think a lot of people get into this thinking, oh, I just want to be on TV. You know, oh, Austin used to do marketing for Aramark. That's hilarious. When you're just starting out, how do you start to get paid for your stories? Oh boy. Yeah, I got some bad news for you. Oh, Sharon asked that? Yeah, I mean, I don't know, man.
That's the question everybody asks me, and I don't know the answer.
I mean, the way to get paid for your story is if you have information that no one else has. If you have a scoop, someone's going to pay you for it. They're not going to pay you a lot, but they will pay you for it. I mean, there just isn't a lot of money in print journalism. There's a reason I work in television. You know, like I left print in when I moved to Washington, so 2013, I think. And like I loved writing. I wanted to be a long form magazine writer. That's all I wanted to do. But I just found that the places that you could do that were dwindling. It was shrinking really quickly. And all my friends were getting laid off, and I got a TV job, and I kind of never looked back. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be a writer, because I still love writing, but it's just it's much more challenging, that field. But you can do it if you have skills. Like if you can report, if you can get information, someone will pay for that story. If you find like an interesting narrative about someone in your community and it's a profile, you're going to have a harder time selling that. Like, even if you're like a 24-year-old gay Talese, if you don't know who that is, just Google him. Like you're still, you can be the best writer in the world, and people aren't going to pay you for your stuff. You need information. People will pay for information. They'll pay for good information. I mean, look at TMZ. They make so much money, and all they have is information. I'm not saying you should do gossip, although there's nothing wrong with that. I would just say that if you can develop a hard skill outside of writing, I know writing is a skill. I spent 4 years cultivating it in Hampshire. It's just, you kind of need a value add for someone to cut you a check for a story. What are some networking tips for journalists? Well, do you like alcohol? No, that's a joke, kind of. But, you know, seriously, if you hang out at journalist bars, like, you'll meet people. Also, you know, just reach out to people. Journalists like talking about their jobs, like everybody likes talking about their jobs. And then, you know, if you know, I'm not talking about Maggie Haberman of the New York Times. She's probably not going to return your email. She's very busy. But find someone at a place you'd like to work, or find someone who has a job that you'd like to have, and just, you know, see if they'll meet up. And you're going to have to cast a wide net. You know, even when I was doing a job hunt a few years back, long before I was at NBC, I should add, you know, and I wanted to meet people whose jobs I was interested in doing. You know, I had to make dozens and dozens of calls, and I'd been in this business 10 years. So, you know, you're going to have to make a lot of phone calls, but that's the best networking tip I have for you, is just email a lot of people, follow up with text messages, hit them on Twitter. Journalists live on Twitter. So you know, eventually you'll get someone who'll just maybe have a DM chat with you, or jump on the phone, or meet for a cup of coffee, or maybe even a beer, and just talk. And do not, you know, don't just ask them for a job, because they're not going to have one to give you. That's the other thing. But just, you should say, I am looking for a job, and if something comes up, or if you can think of how you know, if something comes up that you think would be good for someone like me, or any tips, people would like to help you. Like they're, you know, most journalists are here to help, and like seeing young people just getting started with a passion for this, because it's the industry has taken a beating over, you know, my career the last 20 years. So, you know, that would be my tip to you. You got to be persistent because people are busy. You know, I didn't respond to Sharon's email for like a week and a half. And this was something that Jordan had like suggested I do and that I definitely wanted to do. And it still took me a week and a half to do this, to like get back to her about setting up dates. So like, if you're calling out of the blue, it might take a little bit longer, just be persistent. If you aren't affiliated with a news outlet, how do you do fact checking? How do you know if what people told you is true? Wow, that's a good question. Whose responsibility is it to making sure with mistakes in the facts, right? It's the publication's responsibility to make sure they're not publishing something that's not factual. The problem is a lot of the budgets at print, like a lot of the fact checkers were the first people to go at print publications. So you'll find that less and less. So it's kind of up to you. And the way that you find out if something is true is you double source it. If someone makes a claim to you, you find two other people who say that it's true. And if two other people say that it's not true, that could also be a story. Why is that person lying to you about this thing? But yeah, double sourcing is pretty much the standard for most journalism. Is and if you have a document, if a document says something, you find two people who back it up, or if one person says something, you get one person and a document that backs it up. So you want to, as much as possible, you don't want to print something that isn't factually true. It's happened to me. I've never had a retraction on a piece, but there have been like little errors, dates. I've never misspelled anyone's name. You always find out if you misspelled someone's name because they will write you a letter. Yeah, I've never made a big giant error. One of my favorite stories that I ever wrote was when I was in Afghanistan. It was about a bunch of soldiers, and they had gotten in some pretty serious trouble with a war crimes tribunal. And one of the sergeants had gotten a Bronze Star. And I think he had told me, or I had read in a document, that he got it with a Valor device, which is it's like an extra award. And I thought I checked it, but I guess I didn't. And so one of my favorite stories in the Washington Post has a little correction at the top that he got the Bronze Star, but it didn't have the Valor device attached to it. And I kick myself every time I think about it. And that was over a decade ago at this point. So you really want to be vigorous and detail oriented about fact checking. I have a system that I use for fact checking that pretty much after that story I came up with so that it would never ever happen to me again. It's okay. I mean, it's okay to make these mistakes. These things do happen. You don't want it to happen twice. So what else? Any other questions, folks? I mean, I could definitely talk more, but I'm pretty good at that. But I would like to hear what you guys think about media and what yeah, go ahead.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm wondering how you deal with, say, working in uncomfortable situations.
Yeah.
Like how you were mentioning Afghanistan. I was interning with the UN Rwanda Tribunal.
That's so
and
cool.
I was having to really, thanks, I enjoyed it.
That's amazing.
And part of interning there was really needing to think about, can I work in this environment? How much can I hear daily, weekly? Where's my line?
Yeah.
When will I know that I need to leave? So I'm curious how you deal with that.
Yeah, I think that is a real issue. And thankfully, there have been some journalism nonprofits that have started to help people start to educate journalists about this. Because it used to be, like so much else in society, it was like you gotta put your head down and power through it. But now people are very sensitive to it, and they should be. When I was in Afghanistan, I was there for about a year and a half or so, and I knew when it was time to leave, and when I just needed to bail and get on a plane for a weekend. Whether you're in Afghanistan, you're kind of in the middle of a lot of places. So you could just go to Delhi and you'd be there in an hour, or Beirut and you'd be there in a couple hours. So like, it's something that you really have to take into consideration is your mental health. After Charlottesville, that was traumatic for me in a lot of ways. It was really hard to deal with that for a little while. And, covering the alt-right in that period and just right-wing, you know, you get extremism, you get a lot of like social media hate. I've dodged the worst of it. Women, my colleagues who are women and people of color, there's get it far worse. There's a woman named Brandy Zadrozny at NBC News who's incredible and does incredible reporting. And some of the stuff she endures, she covers right-wing extremism and misinformation online. And some of the stuff that she endures is just absolutely horrible. I don't know how she does it. And she does it really well, better than anyone in the business. She's the best. She got called out by Tucker Carlson a couple weeks ago, and apparently like her whole social media threads were just completely blown up after that. So it's something that a lot of bosses now think about. Like, I know that my supervisor, if I went to him, was like, look, man, I need a break. I'm kind of having some trouble after this thing that happened. They'd be cool, but he'd be cool with it. But it's absolutely something, yeah. I mean, I respect, you know, any kind of work in those tribunal settings. You're going through documents, seeing pictures and hearing witness testimony, survivor testimony. I mean, I can't imagine. I know a lot of that's happening with like the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights and all that stuff that's happening in the Syria context. You know, people really need to take care of themselves. And I think it's gotten a lot better, but you know, there's still a deadline pressure in journalism, especially daily television news journalism. Like, you've got to get the story out, and, you know, you want to, but people really need to, you know, I don't know, people need to take care of themselves. I mean, it's just a business. In the end, like, these companies, Comcast, NBC, Universal, as good as they've been to me, it's like, it's a giant corporation that, you know, they need their content. So it's definitely a dance, but I'm seeing more now people really, and supervisors as well in my own company. I mean, we have lots of wellness stuff. Just today, I got an email from corporate about, you know, how to find moments of serenity in your workday and stuff. And, you know, it seems well-meaning and honest. So thank you for that question, though. That's cool. When did you stop with the UN thing?
I did it, I think, 2007. Cool. And I was trying to pay attention and watch how I was feeling and I thought I was fine. And then one morning I woke up, when the electricity would go off and on again, the television would be on. So I woke up and the television was on, and coincidentally, Hotel Rwanda was playing.
Oh, God.
And the guy calls someone in the government, and my flatmate was on the defense for that guy. And I just started crying and crying and crying. And it was like, okay, you know, I passed the line and I didn't know it. So it's hard to see where it is.
Yeah. And I've seen people working in the Middle East context, especially people who I've known who have not really taken that into account or tried to just power through it. And it's not great. Once you hit your 40s, you know, and you've been doing that for 15, 20 years, you know, it really takes a toll on you if you don't talk to someone about it, or if you don't take a break. You know, it's not, you know, it's like your emotional health is like physical health, man. If you break a bone, you break your leg, you can't keep walking on it, or else some bad things are going to happen to you. So, you know, it's something to take very, very seriously, especially with all the conflict reporting that goes on. So Mary wants to know, this isn't a journalism-based question. I've been freelance writing for about 5 years. I'd like to do a deep dive into a couple of subjects. Awesome. Do you have thoughts about writing nonfiction books and how writers can get started? Yeah. So the only way to write is to write. I've never written a nonfiction book. I kind of thought about doing one about right-wing extremism. And Slack is a thing that's terrible, by the way. I don't know if you guys have this in your workplace. Anyway, sorry, someone just slacked me. What was I saying? Right. So writing a book, I sort of started an outline of one after Charlottesville, actually thinking, well, there could be something here, but I didn't follow through with it, but I have lots and lots of friends who do, who have written these books. And it's also very hard. You're going to have to write a lot up front for free. The first thing I would do is write like kind of a brief prospectus, like under 5,000 words, and then try and meet up with some agents who can read it and let you know if they think it has possibility or what angles you should take. The one thing you don't want to do is go report and write an entire book and then, then try and find an agent. Agents, I've only had conversations with a couple of them in a professional kind of setting, but it's my impression that they really want to have some kind of hand in guiding the narrative. again, this is not, I've never written a book, so it's not my total area of expertise, but in talking with friends who have, and in talking with agents about possible book projects on my end, it's a treatise, something short-ish, under 3,000 or 5,000 words. An outline is good. My father actually has done a lot of like marketing for publishing, so he also had we've talked a lot about this, is a short treatise, an outline that's more or less there, the bones of the thing, and then try and meet up with an agent, and go from there if you can. But you should expect, like, in advance of definitely under 50 grand, possibly 30 or less. It's sort of like what I've been told by folks. But I also was looking at right-wing extremism, which at the time wasn't like a particularly sexy or like popular subject matter. If you're writing a book about the Royals, I bet you could probably score something.
All right, thanks. That's super helpful.
Good. Okay. Yeah, sorry.
No,
It's
really,
not my area, but that's sort of like my
No, that's a good starting point for sure. I appreciate that a lot. Thank you.
No doubt. I'll give out my email a little bit. I'm happy to talk if you have any reporting questions or anything, or I just love to hear about it. It's still something I could do. Like, if a subject really grabbed me by the collar that I wanted to spend however many years it takes to do, it's definitely something I could see myself doing in the future. But Godspeed. People who finish books, man, I have great respect for them.
Well, thank you. We'll see.
I just want to do a little time check.
Oh, sure.
We have 6 minutes left. There's a question in the chat. Have all the TV outlets you have worked with had the same journalist standards? And so if that ends up being a quick one, if there are any, I want to invite, if there are any students here who have one last question, to put that in the chat as well. I think we'll have time for maybe this one and one more. I would
love to hear from any students too. That'd be really awesome. Pretty much every place. I've been very lucky to work at very high standard type journalism places. PBS NewsHour, Vice, and NBC. They all have, their guidebooks, like their handbooks for editorial standards, they have different language, but they're all pretty much the same. And the one thing about NBC is there's just like a lot more lawyers. Like they lawyer, like I can call a lawyer 24 hours, 7 days a week with a question about anything. And they have a whole standards department. It's really cool. And they'll help you with scripts so that you don't get in trouble, so that you don't, say or do anything dumber than I would normally do. I've been very lucky in that way. I know that not all outlets have the same standards though. I've also been lucky to just be able to do what I consider objective journalism that isn't biased or, of no party or, without fear or favor, without, kind of going towards one party or another. Everyone's pretty mad at my stories, so you're doing something right. Any students? There's no students. Come on, not one of you. Bummer. Okay, so right, only 4. Karen, I found 4 alums listed as journalists on the Hampshire network, but there are probably another 4 here. Well, we need to start a club.
There's a guy on the Hampshire network actually that you can start a group.
I think maybe we should do that. After this, I just might do it. Actually, after this, I'm going to shoot an interview with a Republican woman who does not want to get the COVID vaccine. That's story is that Republicans, I think it's something like a third or more of them will not be getting the COVID vaccine. And that's my next story. You heard it here first, folks.
Would you say that they're overplaying this vaccine reluctance in general because there's no other side?
I think that's a great question, actually. It's a really good question. The survey data is pretty, it's 50% of Republican men and like, I think a third or more of Republicans overall. I don't think that's overplaying it. That's the largest community that's vaccine hesitant in the country. It's more than the next, it's much more than the next 2, I think, combined, which are African-Americans and Hispanics, Latinos.
But in general, the concept of the vaccination, those people are willing to take it. Nobody's really saying, okay, we have to cover them. in a way that shows the other people too much. I mean, there's like, it's sort of like whenever there's two sides to a story, even if they aren't equally listed, we're sort of biased in going like, oh, we have to talk about the climate deniers,
right?
Even though there's 1,000 scientists for every one.
So this is a really classic, I'm glad we got this in under the wire. This is like a classic journalism, like journalism school debate thing here, that like, when you show, if you only have two sides of a story in a piece, both sides automatically get the same amount of weight because, you've mentioned one and the other, so they must be more or less equal. At PBS NewsHour, they used to actually time how much each idea got in a piece. So if it was an 8-minute piece and the Republican got to speak for 3 or 4 minutes, the Democrat got exactly 3 or 4 minutes, which I actually think is a bit much. But I think you're right. There's something to that. But here's what I'll say about the anti-vax, the people who don't want the COVID vaccine in particular, is that in places where Republicans are really, really heavily represented, certain parts of the South, certain parts of California, entire towns are mostly, entirely red. Of course, we know this. This is not news. Those places may not achieve herd immunity because if truly 50% of Republican men aren't going to get vaccinated, then you have a really big chunk of regions not getting vaccinated. So your point is very well taken, and I think it's the climate thing is a great example of it. Pretty much every scientist thinks that climate change is real, but you put one scientist in a piece saying it's not, and you've automatically increased that person's megaphone. That's totally a legitimate critique and something that we're going to keep wrestling with going forward. That one's not going away.
But I think that in the anti-vaccination issue, it's not so much to me, look, we found a group of people who don't want to get vaccinated. It's more like, do they understand what's going to happen to them if they don't get vaccinated? Are they thinking like, oh, well, everybody else is going to be vaccinated, so I don't need to get vaccinated because I'll be safe that way? Or do they just think that COVID doesn't exist still because there's plenty of those? Have they,
in my reporting and talking to these people, it's mostly the second one. It's more like, I think COVID's overplayed by the media. And the second part is the vaccine was created too quickly. I don't trust it. I don't think it's been, properly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All not true in my, personal opinion, but also professionally, I just think that the evidence is pretty strong that these are safe, effective vaccines. COVID is obviously very real. I personally interviewed frontline doctors who have just had absolutely horrendous goes with this whole thing this last year. Right. I think it's, to your point, it's mostly the second thing. It's that they don't trust the vaccine. They think COVID is kind of overblown.
And so the number one cause of death in the United States this last year is now COVID-19.
I understand that, yeah.
And somehow that doesn't get into their mentality. They didn't notice that. They've probably had heart attacks. They've had all sorts of things, but they've never never had COVID in their
I think
world.
we need to do a little time check. We're just past 6.
Yeah, and there's my email in the comments. So please send me an email if you like. I'm happy to stick around for another few minutes.
Just a sec for what you are available for in terms of emailing you.
Yeah. So certainly if you have a professional question, I am here for you. If you are Professor Kennedy, I would very much like you to email me so I can say hi and catch up. But yeah, no, if you have any questions about journalism, if you are a student on this chat and you want advice about getting into the business, I know a little bit about some internship programs and how you can prepare if you're like going to be a senior next year, or if you're going to be completing your Div 3 next year, or maybe you're just getting started at Hampshire, whatever. I can tell you the kind of skills you should start building now to prepare for sort of an entry-level job when you complete your Div 3. But if you're already graduated and you want some advice about getting into the business, I can help you with that too. I have a few contacts at places that do have solid internship programs that will pay you also. But there are many you should be prepared to know that like just that will not pay you. It only adds the inequality in our industry and basically allows like rich kids to be able to take these jobs while their parents subsidize them because they don't, they're not getting paid. But yeah, so I'm happy to help with any of that stuff. If you've got a project that you'd like some advice on, that's fine. Happy to help you out. Just, yeah, you're welcome to use my contact. Mary Ellen, you have a question? I see a hand thingy.
Oh, I think that was a clapping hand.
Oh yeah, clapping hands.
Yeah, okay, you got a few clapping hands.
Yay, clap. My wife's yelling at me. I think that's hilarious. Thank you all for doing this. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Anything else, Sharon? Is there anything else? Did I miss anything?
I think that's it. This was so fascinating. I think we could just sit here and talk about news and journalism for hours. So thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. This has been really cool. It's nice to reconnect with the Hampshire community.
Yeah, and good luck with your next interview.
Thank you.
You could, if you want to email us a link to the report, we can put it in a follow-up email to people.
Absolutely, it'll be out next week. I think it's gonna take a little bit of doing because my correspondent is actually in Florida and I'm shooting the interview in California. So we'll see, but I'll send you guys a link once it airs.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Bye,
everybody. Thank you for doing this.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.